This is Candle and Coffin. Let's uncover the forgotten truth beneath the ashes of history. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing how far this story travels. The wind across the Eurasian steppe once carried more than the scent of wild thyme and blood. It carried stories, some sung around fires, others etched in bone beneath earth mounds. But a few were buried so deep beneath myth and empire that they slipped from the pages of official memory until now. In the shadows of Scythia, a silent war was waged, not one of empires clashing on open fields, but of stories contorted, of truths made legend, and of women turned to myth. For centuries, the Greeks spoke of the Amazons, fierce female warriors who lived without men, rode horses like lightning, and fired arrows faster than thought. They were said to have stormed the gates of Troy, battled Heracles, and died with honor beneath foreign skies. To the Greeks, they were paradoxes unnatural, alien, impossible. But what if they weren't myth at all? What if the Amazons were real? And what if their true story has been deliberately misunderstood, rewritten through the lens of male empire and cultural superiority? The warriors of Scythia, nomadic, lethal, and proudly female, did not merely defend their land. They disrupted the boundaries of gender, power, and memory. They lived and died in a world where women bore arms and buried their dead in armor. But theirs was a war fought not only on the battlefield, but in the conscience of history itself. Today, in windswept burial mounds across the Pontic-Caspian steppe, archaeologists uncover bones of young women, some no older than 16, buried with bows, iron-tipped arrows, and daggers clutched at their sides. Some died violently, some were chieftains, and together they whisper a truth too long silenced. This is the story of the secret war of the Amazon warriors of Scythia, of freedom born in the saddle, of identity forged in blood, and of a legacy nearly erased by the civilizations that feared them. A story not of myth, but of power. Not of fantasy, but of memory reclaimed. Let us begin. Long before Rome cast its long shadow across the Mediterranean, and before Athens sculpted its marble, gods, there was the wind. It howled ungoverned across the vast grasslands between the Danube and the Altai, a boundless wilderness stitched only by the hoofbeats of nomads. These were not the quiet lands of settled farmers, or the echoing sanctuaries of temples. This was a continent of motion, of firelit raids and galloping phalanxes, an empire without walls. And among the fiercest of those who ruled this shifting terrain were the Scythians, a tribal confederation so elusive, so feared, that even the great Darius of Persia would come to dread their name. To the sedentary civilizations of the south, Greek, Persian, Assyrian, the Scythians were ghosts on horseback, barbarian archers who killed from afar, vanished without trace, and bowed to no king. Yet, hidden within their legend was a detail too strange, too incompatible with Mediterranean assumptions of order. Women, adorned in armor, riding into battle as equals. The Greeks tried to resolve this contradiction, not by acceptance, but by myth-making. They named these warrior women the Amazonesses, placing them beyond the boundaries of the known world, at once fascinated and terrified. But for the Scythians, there was no contradiction. Gender was not a chain. In a world where survival depended on speed, precision, and ferocity, a woman who could draw a bow from horseback at full gallop was not an anomaly, she was an asset. And so, across the steppes, daughters were taught as sons were, how to ride, how to fight, how to kill, not as imitation men, but as warriors in their own right. The first Greek to write of these women with something approaching respect was Herodotus, the so-called father of history. In his histories, He tells of the Sauromate descendants of Scythian men and Amazon women. He recounts their customs, that their women hunted, rode, fought in war, and never married until they had slain a man in battle. To Greek ears, these were monstrous oddities. But beneath the prejudice, Herodotus preserves a glimmer of truth, one that modern archaeology now begins to validate. The Amazon warriors were not fantasy. They were real. And they did not merely fight, they led. But their war was not only waged with arrows and blades. It was a war for self-determination in a world that demanded conformity. A war against erasure. And as their bodies are uncovered from the soil of forgotten steppe tombs, their silence begins to break. The burial mounds rose like ancient scars across the steppe kurgans. They were called each one a solemn monument to lives once fiercely lived. It was from these earth-covered tombs that the myth began to fracture. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, teams of archaeologists and bioarchaeologists working across Ukraine, southern Russia, and Kazakhstan began unearthing graves that would shake the foundations of classical history. Within these kurgans were bodies adorned not with domestic relics, but with weapons of war, composite boughs of wood and sinew, iron-tipped arrows, bronze swords, and sometimes even horse gear. Yet these were not the remains of men. The pelvises, jawlines, and DNA markers told a different story. These were women. Some were adolescents, others aged leaders. They bore the wounds of battle, fractured ribs, arrow-pierced limbs, and blade-hewn skulls. These women were warriors, not in myth, but in bone. In 2019, a genetic study published in Science Advances confirmed that roughly 37% of Scythian warrior graves containing weapons also contained female remains. The Amazons, it seemed, had never been lost. They had only been misnamed, misread, buried beneath layers of cultural contempt. Greek writers like Strabo and Plutarch had dismissed them as fanciful, the product of Oriental exaggeration. But the bodies told no lies. The evidence forced a reckoning. For centuries, classical historians had projected Greek gender roles onto the past, assuming that military life was an exclusively male domain. But the Scythians did not bow to such binaries. In a culture forged in constant movement and conflict, competence mattered more than custom. And so their women became warriors, not in rebellion against nature, but in harmony with it. Mounted on short, muscular steppe horses, these female archers would ride low and fast, unleashing death with terrifying precision. Their composite bows, engineered from wood, horn, and sinew, were compact and lethal, designed to be fired mid-gallop. They could strike at distance, evade pursuit, and vanish into the tall grasses. To Persian and Greek armies used to phalanxes in siege towers, they were like smoke, ungraspable, lethal, unrelenting. But beyond the weapons, the kurgans revealed something deeper. Buried alongside these women were tokens of rank mirrors, jewelry, intricate goldwork, ceremonial robes suggesting not only participation, but leadership. These were not mere foot soldiers. They were chieftains, priestesses, tacticians. Their war was layered, a war of survival, of gendered defiance, and of cultural autonomy in a world that refused to believe in them. And as each burial unearthed another forgotten name, the myth of the Amazons began to whisper its true form. A memory exiled by empire, now clawing its way back into the light. The Greeks had no language for women, who ruled with iron and blood. In their world, order rested upon the subjugation of the feminine domesticity, obedience, fertility. To encounter a culture where women bore arms, led tribes, and chose death over submission was not only alien, it was threatening. And so, the Scythian warrior women were cast into legend, their reality distorted into monstrous abstraction. In vase paintings, they became exoticized, depicted with Phrygian caps, patterned trousers, and recurved bows, always in the act of dying beneath Greek swords. In poetry, they were temptresses and killers, lovers and foes, always defeated to restore the cosmic order. Yet these depictions betray a deeper fear, a fear that somewhere beyond the borders of civilization, a different order reigned. Herodotus, in his account of the Sauromatae, attempted to rationalize their existence by inventing an origin story that the Amazons, after being captured by Greeks, slew their captors, sailed east, and mated with young Scythian men who respected their prowess. The union created a new people, one where women hunted, fought, and took no husband until they'd proven themselves in battle. Whether myth or fact, the tale reveals a truth that ran too deep for Herodotus to grasp fully, that the Scythians did not merely accept female warriors. They were born of them. Yet Greek discomfort with this idea ran so deep that even in admiration, there was erasure. The Amazons were permitted to exist only in the realm of the impossible borderland demons or fantasy queens, never as real, breathing counterparts. But while Athens built marble temples and recited tragedies, the Amazons of Scythia lived and died on the steppe, their horses swift, their knives sharp, their eyes cold with purpose. They fought not in rebellion, but in tradition. They hunted. With hawks, tattooed their limbs with clan sigils, and passed down stories through bloodline and blade. Their communities were not matriarchies in the modern sense, but meritocracies forged in hardship. A woman's place was not assigned by birth, but by will. And in that will, they found something the city-states of the South could never fully crush: autonomy. Theirs was a war not only against foreign invasion, but against the very architecture of erasure. Each battle was a stanza in a poem unwritten, each death a memory unspoken by the victors who feared them. For the Greeks, history was a script with roles pre-written, but the Amazons real, flesh and bone. Scythian Amazons burned the script and rode through the ashes. To understand the nature of the Amazonian War, one must first understand the Scythian world, not merely its geography, but its psyche. The Scythians were not an empire in the traditional sense. They built no cities, minted no coins, carved no statues to immortalize their rulers. Instead, they carved paths across the vast grasslands, stretching from the Black Sea to the Altai Mountains. Their empire was one of mobility, an intricate network of tribal alliances, seasonal migrations, and horse-borne diplomacy. Power resided in motion, not monuments. To sedentary empires, they were barbarians. To themselves, they were wolves among sheep. In such a world, hierarchy bent to pragmatism. The horse was sacred, the bow divine. And into this crucible of survival, women were forged not as complements to men, but as sovereign actors in their own right. From the age of 5 or 6, Scythian girls were trained in horseback riding, archery, and the rudiments of war. Play was indistinguishable from preparation. Childhood ended not with marriage, but with initiation: first hunt, first kill, first blood drawn in defense of kin. This upbringing was not a deviation from Scythian norms, it was the norm. Anthropological studies of burial sites, such as Pokrovka and Nadezhdinka, reveal that nearly a third of all warrior graves belonged to adolescent females, many buried with bows curved to fit their size, alongside arrowheads marked with tribal symbols. Some were interred with mirrors symbolizing not vanity, but the duality of death and remembrance. Others bore signs of command: gilded harness fittings, engraved daggers, and bronze headdresses. These were not ornamental lives. These were leaders in the saddle. Their war, then, was both personal and cultural. Every ride across enemy territory, every ambush launched from tree line or riverbank, was an affirmation that they existed outside the logic of foreign empires. They refused the role scripted for them by distant philosophers and poets. They were not the anti-woman, not a cautionary tale. They were the blade that turned back upon the hand that reached to define them. And yet, even in their resilience, they bore tragedy. Many died young, often violently. The same kurgans that preserved their legend preserved their suffering. Shattered ribs, sword cleaves to the spine, arrowheads embedded in the pelvis. There was no glory untouched by pain. But this too was part of their truth. They did not ask for myth, only memory. And in the soil that held their remains for over 2,000 years, a different war still raged, the war to be remembered not as fantasy, but as fact. Among the many fires that lit the Scythian night, none burned brighter than the stories carried. In song, oral histories passed through generations like heirlooms of breath and blood. These were not the scripted dramas of Athens, carved into amphitheaters and taught to elites. They were memory itself, shaped by the rhythm of hooves and the silence of death. It was in these tales, sung beneath stars by women with wind-burned faces and eyes too old for their age, that the true legacy of the Amazon warriors endured. They did not need marble effigies. They had lineage. Their daughters bore their names, their injuries, their laughter. And yet, even these fires began to flicker as the encroaching empires pressed closer. In the 6th century BCE, Darius I of Persia launched an ambitious campaign into Scythian territory, a campaign driven not by conquest alone, but by a need to define, to categorize, to tame. The Persians built pontoon bridges across the Danube, drove their armies into the wilds, and found nothing, or rather, no cities to burn, no capitals to seize. The Scythians refused to engage directly. They set fire to the grass, poisoned the wells, and rode in circles around their enemy. It was warfare as erosion, not collision. Darius's great army returned humiliated, shattered by ghosts on horseback. And among those phantoms were women. Persian chroniclers made little mention of this, perhaps out of disbelief or denial. But Greek observers knew better. The Scythians had no standing army in the Greek sense. They had a nation of warriors, trained from birth, capable of vanishing and striking without warning. In such a system, the division between male and female combatants dissolved like morning mist. During this period, Herodotus gathered his accounts. He traveled to the Black Sea, spoke with Scythian informants, and recorded their customs with a blend of curiosity and disdain. His stories, half anthropology, half allegory, tell of warrior women who spoke Scythian, wore trousers, and shunned domesticity. He calls them Amazons, but places them just beyond the horizon of truth, as if proximity to fact required myth to shield it. And yet, his fragments, flawed as they are, became the scaffolding for centuries of imagination. It was easier to fictionalize these women than to accept that the Greek worldview was incomplete. For if the Amazons were real, then what else had been misnamed, misjudged, misremembered? This was the secret war's most insidious front, not fought with weapons, but with ideas. The war to define what history could contain and what it must forget. By the 4th century BCE, the steppe had begun to shift not its grasses or rivers, which ran as they always had, but its rhythm. The Scythians, once unchallenged in their dominion over the northern Black Sea and Caspian ranges, now found themselves pressed by rising powers. The Sarmatians from the east, the Thracians from the southwest, and eventually the expanding reach of Macedonian ambition. It was in this crucible of pressure and resistance that the last great echoes of the Amazon warriors would sound. Among the Sarmatians, a successor culture both kin and rival to the Scythians, the tradition of armed women did not die, it hardened. Greek sources begin to shift in tone. Instead of mythical distance, their mentions become edged with tactical recognition. The Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus later wrote that the Sarmatian women wore armor like men and rode into battle. Beside them, in the graves of the Middle Sarmatian period burial grounds, like Filipovka and Ust-Kamenogorsk, archaeologists have uncovered a startling continuation. Richly adorned tombs of women buried not only with arms, but with ceremonial regalia, suggesting roles as both warriors and spiritual leaders. One woman was found buried in a gilded bronze helmet with a feathered crest, a sword across her chest, her feet wrapped in leather dyed with cinnabar. Nearby, the remains of her horse lay folded, as if still awaiting its rider. These women, heirs to the Amazon legacy, were not remnants, they were resurgence. The Greeks, despite themselves, began to depict them more frequently, not only in battle, but in mourning, in solitude, in contemplation. Their portrayal moved from monstrous to mournful, as if acknowledging something precious slipping beyond their reach. Alexander the Great, during his eastern campaigns, reportedly encountered a queen named Thalestris, leader of a tribe of warrior women who sought union not in submission, but in strength. Plutarch tells the story, though later historians dispute its veracity, of how she arrived with 300 women warriors to bear children with Alexander, hoping to forge a lineage of conquerors. Whether fact or fable, the tale reveals a crucial truth. By this time, the Amazons had transcended both geography and fear. They had become symbols of power unmoored from patriarchy, of sovereignty beyond the polis. And for the Greeks, whose own society was fracturing under the weight of its contradictions, the Amazon became not just a threat, but a mirror. What they saw reflected was not savagery, but an alternate history, one in which the blade need not be born of masculinity alone. This, too, was part of the secret war, the war of ideas embedded within bodies, the war of stories etched into silence. For each warrior buried beneath the steppe was not merely a casualty of time, they were a challenge to time itself. The silence that followed the fall of Scythian and Sarmatian dominance was not the silence of peace, it was the silence of erasure. As Roman frontiers advanced and Hellenistic culture ossified into imperial doctrine, the stories of the Amazon warriors were folded inward, reduced from memory into metaphor. In this new world, with the Mediterranean's empires viewed permanence as power, the transient brilliance of steppe culture became a threat too ephemeral to conquer and too profound to preserve. The Amazon became not a warrior, but a caution, an allegory of unchecked womanhood, of feminine rebellion, of the other brought too close. In Roman art, she was stripped of agency, used to symbolize disorder, tamed by the righteous spear of empire. Even in defeat, her image was weaponized, her bow now broken, her horse stilled, her gaze lowered in reluctant awe before the conqueror. This was not remembrance. It was containment. The steppe, however, remembered differently. In the oral traditions of the Caucasus, among Ossetian and Circassian epics, female warriors continued to appear not as curiosities, but as foundational figures. In the Nart sagas of the Ossetians, descended in part from Sarmatian ancestry, there are tales of Satana, a fierce and wise warrior woman who rides into battle, tricks enemies, and commands the fate of clans. In these traditions, the line between male and female valor is blurred, even irrelevant. Valor was not gendered, it was lived. And in the far reaches of the steppe and Central Asia, echoes of this cultural memory endured even into the early medieval period, where travelers' accounts speak sometimes incredulously of women who hunted, fought, and led. But in the West, the Amazon name had already begun to drift into fantasy. Medieval bestiaries and Renaissance allegories transformed her into a symbol of inversion, sometimes admirable, often sinful. She no longer held a sword to claim sovereignty. She held it to tempt, to lure, to betray. It was no accident that during the witch trials of Europe, women who defied societal roles, particularly those who led, fought, or healed, were accused of unnatural power. The ancient memory of the Amazon had not vanished. It had been twisted into a warning. Yet the bones in the ground told a different story. In 1993, in southern Russia, a kurgan was unearthed containing the skeleton of a girl no older than 16. Her body was pierced by an arrow to the lung. She had bled to death in battle. Buried with her were 2 spears, a quiver of iron-tipped arrows, and a ceremonial headdress made of copper and glass. Her pelvis showed no signs of childbirth. Her teeth marked the wear of a diet rich in meat and milk. She was trained, hardened, and young, and in her silent repose, she refuted centuries of doubt. This girl, and thousands like her, had fought not merely in wars of territory, but in a war of remembrance. And though they lost the battle for their names, their story endures in the soil, waiting for history to listen again. The question that hangs like a blade over this forgotten legacy is not whether the Amazons existed, but why we ever believed they didn't. For centuries, Western historiography operated on an assumption so deeply ingrained it passed for truth, that history was made by men, recorded by men, and inherited through male lineage. Anything outside this frame, be it female warriors, matrilineal customs, or egalitarian kinship structures, was treated not as data, but as deviation. Thus, when archaeologists unearthed the bones of weapon-bearing women on the steppe, early interpretations often bent backward to preserve the old narrative. Surely these were ceremonial burials. Some said symbols, not soldiers. Or perhaps the weapons were heirlooms, not tools of war. It could not be that the narrative itself was flawed, but evidence, when it accumulates, becomes its own rebellion. The forensic profiles didn't lie. Calloused vertebrae from a lifetime on horseback, arrowhead scars and rib cages, muscular asymmetry from constant archery, all markers of warriors, not wives. And still, resistance persisted. This is the quiet violence of erasure, not the act of denying, but the slow grinding down of belief, the casting of doubt upon truth, until only silence remains. The Amazons of Scythia were victims of this violence. Not only were their names unrecorded, but their entire paradigm of life, a world where gender did not dictate the right to fight or lead, was deemed impossible by the civilizations that followed. It is not enough to say they were forgotten. They were actively obscured, and yet their legacy pulses through the very language of power. Even the word Amazon lives on, co-opted by empires ancient and modern, stripped of its origin. What was once a people became a metaphor, then a brand, then a symbol so diluted it could be bent to serve whatever narrative the present required. But beneath these layers of appropriation, the truth remains buried but intact. Not myth, not metaphor, but memory. A collective inheritance encoded in bone, scar, and soil. And perhaps most haunting of all is that their story, this secret war against forgetting, was never really secret. It was visible, always, for those who dared to look. In the burned remnants of nomadic campsites, in the curvature of iron arrowheads, in the fractured limbs of adolescent skeletons buried with pride. The war waged by the Amazon warriors of Scythia was a war fought on horseback and in silence, in resistance, and in death. And now, centuries later, it rages still not on the battlefield, but in the battleground of narrative itself. For every history told without them is a victory handed to the forgetting. And every time we remember them fully, honestly, without myth or metaphor, they win a little more. In the great march of empire, certain voices are always the first to be drowned out, those that do not conform, do not kneel, do not write their stories in the language of the conqueror. The Amazon warriors of Scythia were such voices. They did not leave behind temples or manifestos, but their silence was not absence. It was defiance. Theirs was a history written not in books, but in action, in the arc of a bow drawn under an open sky, in the imprint of a horse's hoof pressed into frozen grass, in the unblinking stare of a woman facing death without fear. They lived in a continuum of resistance, a centuries-long refusal to be placed inside the boundaries drawn by foreign men. Even today, the term Amazon evokes more fiction than fact. It conjures fantasy's superhuman strength, mythic isolation, hypersexualized armor, but rarely does it conjure the reality of these women, dirty, calloused, hungry, fierce. They were not demigods. They were nomads. They bled. They grieved. They rode into battle beside brothers, lovers, sons. They died young and were buried with their weapons because their weapons were part of them. And yet the Western tradition, steeped in its own rigid dualities, male and female, civilized and savage, reason and chaos, had no room for such contradiction. So it rebranded them. The Amazons became myth, their truth too disruptive to survive unaltered. But the Scythian world knew them differently. To their own people, they were not anomalies. They were leaders, matriarchs, daughters whose hands could cradle a child or draw blood with equal skill. Their courage was not ornamental, not an exception to the rule. It was the rule. And though the Scythians themselves eventually faded from dominance, absorbed and scattered by the currents of empire and migration, the echoes of their warriors endured. In the burial sites, left untouched for millennia, archaeologists found not only weapons and armor, but ritual, a kind of reverence. These were not forgotten women. They were remembered with gold, with horses sacrificed for the journey beyond, with rites that spoke of honor and sorrow. And perhaps that is the most jarring truth of all, that while later civilizations turned them into curiosities or monsters, their own people saw them as necessary, even sacred. It is this dissonance, the chasm between how they lived and how they were remembered, that forms the true battlefield of their legacy. For every myth spun about them, there is a truth buried beneath. And now, as the soil gives up its secrets and the bones speak louder than the epics, we are faced with a question, more unsettling than whether they existed. We must ask instead, why did we ever believe they couldn't? Across the centuries, the myth of the Amazons grew wings, traveling from the writings of Herodotus to the paintings of Renaissance masters, from the pages of chivalric romance to the scripts of modern cinema. Yet with every retelling, their form distorted further, shaped not by truth, but by projection. They became creatures of paradox, too strong to be women, too beautiful to be warriors, too independent to be real. This was the final front of their secret war, the war of appropriation. For in the eyes of those who could not understand them, they had to be tamed, even in memory. In medieval Europe, Amazonian tales were preserved as moral riddles, examples of female excess, symbols of chaos that could only be quelled by masculine force. In the courtly epics of France and Germany, Amazon queens appear only to fall in love with noble knights, abandoning their tribes for the sake of civilized romance. The blade becomes a wedding ring, the horse traded for a throne. In Enlightenment texts, their existence is debated like a fable, referenced with smug skepticism. They are dismissed not for lack of evidence, but because they do not fit the architects of the age's notions of nature and order. Later, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, as European empires turned their gaze toward exotic lands, the Amazon became a colonial fantasy repackaged as erotic spectacle or racial curiosity. Travelogues spoke of tribes where women ruled, often with tones of disbelief or titillation. The academic world, meanwhile, turned its back on the growing archaeological data that challenged its canon. When female skeletons were found with weapons, the explanations were twisted. They were wives buried with their husbands' tools, or priestesses playing symbolic roles. The truth, though buried alongside them, remained too uncomfortable. Yet, with the rise of modern archaeology, the dust began to lift. Soviet and post-Soviet excavations, particularly those carried out in the vast steppes of Kazakhstan and southern Russia, revealed hundreds of graves once labeled male that, under DNA analysis, proved female. These were not symbolic burials. They bore the markers of hard-worn lives, muscle stress from archery, broken bones from horseback falls, wounds from close combat. Some had been buried with more weapons than any man in their tribe. And still, even today, the academic world struggles to rewrite what was once dogma. The resistance is not purely intellectual, it is emotional. To accept the Amazon as fact is to unravel centuries of historical architecture built upon male exclusivity. It means admitting that for thousands of years, women were not simply passive recipients of history, but active shapers of it. That truth, long buried beneath conquest and condescension, is now clawing its way out of the ground. The question remains, will we listen, or will we, like those before us, choose the comfort of myth over the challenge of reality? As the modern world reevaluates the architecture of its past, the Amazon warriors of Scythia emerge not merely as artifacts of curiosity, but as a challenge to everything we thought we knew about civilization. Their presence forces a reckoning, not only with gender, but with power, with history, with the cultural lens through which stories are told, and truths are sculpted into silence. For the Greeks, the Amazon was always positioned just outside the city wall, geographically distant, morally inverted, the other to be defeated and assimilated. But what if they were never outside at all? What if they were within, underneath, behind the very foundations upon which empire was built? The fear they inspired wasn't born from savagery. It was born from familiarity. The Amazon represented a possibility that a different kind of order, non-patriarchal, fluid, mobile, had not only existed, but thrived. That possibility had to be destroyed, not with armies alone, but with narratives. And so the war continued, reshaped with every era. In the Enlightenment, the Amazon became a figure of satire, her authority mocked as masculine mimicry. In the 19th century, she was exoticized, a figure for colonial fantasy. In the 20th, she returned in pulp fiction and cinema unreal, sexualized, defanged, yet the archaeological record remained stubborn. No myth could explain away the scars on bones, the stress marks on vertebrae, the arrowheads embedded in pelvises. No legend could account for the recurring patterns, hundreds of graves, spread over thousands of miles, across multiple centuries, all telling the same story. Women trained for war, honored in death, remembered by their people, erased by others. But the 21st century, with its digital tools and interdisciplinary fervor, has begun to pierce the veil. Ancient DNA studies have confirmed the biological sex of warriors, once misidentified as male. Strontium isotope analysis has mapped their movements, showing they traveled far and fought often. And experimental archaeology has reconstructed the bows they used, revealing a technology so efficient it rivaled later composite weaponry of the Mongol horde. These weren't tribal curiosities. They were innovators, strategists, carriers of cultural memory encoded in both martial skill and ritual practice. And still, as their story re-emerges, resistance persists not from lack of evidence, but from the inertia of tradition. To fully accept the Amazon is to admit that the boundaries of ancient gender roles, so long taken for granted, were never as rigid as we claimed. It is to confront the idea that for thousands of years, we built our historical house with one eye closed. And now, as we force the door open, we must decide, do we relegate these warriors to the footnotes again? Or do we finally let them take their rightful place in the narrative, not as symbols, but as subjects? Not as dreams, but as daughters of the dust and glory they once commanded? In the age of empire, the pen often proved mightier than the sword, not because it chronicled truth, but because it shaped the illusions future generations would inherit as reality. Rome, inheritor of Hellenic prejudice, continued the tradition of marginalizing the Amazon figure, absorbing her into its vast machine of conquest and control. While Roman poets like Virgil and Ovid played with Amazon imagery, they did so only within tightly controlled symbolic frames, domesticated into allegory, tamed into tragedy. The Amazon became the failed queen, the dead lover, the deviant who dared to rise against Rome's ordained order. In one telling, she dies at the feet of a hero. In another, she falls in love and abandons her cause. These stories serve not to illuminate, but to obscure, to repurpose the Amazon as a lesson, not a legacy. The Scythians themselves faded from the imperial map by the 1st century CE, their culture absorbed, scattered, and ultimately consumed by the migratory churn of the Great Steppe. But their memory, though battered by time, refused to vanish. In the legends of the Alans, in the songs of the Circassians, in the oral traditions of the steppe peoples who followed the memory of women who fought, who led, who bled, survived like embers in winter soil. And from time to time, the world glimpsed those embers. In the 6th century CE, Procopius recorded that among the tribes north of the Black Sea, women still rode to war. Centuries later, during the Mongol conquests, European observers would speak in hushed awe of nomadic women who fought alongside their husbands, their eyes hard as the lands they rode. These were not new phenomena. They were echoes, but Western. Chroniclers, trapped in their own blind inheritance, continued to categorize such women as anomalies, as though history could not contain them unless it found a way to exile them from seriousness. And yet, the land refused to forget. Every time the steppe thawed, it offered back a fragment, an arrowhead, a rib cage, a bracelet carved with solar symbols. In Kazakhstan, archaeologists found a woman buried with a bronze mirror and a spear, a blend of introspection and aggression. In Ukraine, a girl of 14 was buried with her horse, her bow, and a crown of bone and amber. These were not myths. These were data points in a story long suppressed. The war they waged was no longer against invaders. It was against oblivion. And it remains so. For today, as museum shelves display their jewelry and catalog their tools, the plaques still hesitate to name them fully. The label reads, "Female burial with weapons." Not warrior, not leader, not Amazon. The language still limps behind the truth. And the war continues, not with swords, but with questions. Will we speak of them plainly? Will we honor their reality, not as spectacle, but as part of our collective inheritance? Or will we, like Rome, bury them in metaphor once more? There is a cruel poetry in the way history selects its voices. Those who build in stone are remembered. Those who ride the wind are forgotten. The Amazon warriors of Scythia built nothing to last in marble, but they etched their lives into the bones of the earth, into the hearts of daughters, who remembered the weight of a bowstring and the silence before a charge. Their monuments are not pillars, but the scars left in the ribs of fallen enemies, the worn grooves in ancient saddles, the soot-stained blades buried beside them. And yet, their story so violent, so vital, was reduced to fable by cultures that feared its implications. The West has long mythologized its margins. It turns realities too dangerous to reconcile into stories safe for consumption. So the Amazon became a fiction, a woman with one breast, a queen of an invisible land, a dream to be conquered or corrupted. What was inconvenient was abstracted. What was true was buried. But the bones speak louder now. In recent decades, as forensic science, isotope analysis, and gender-aware archaeology sharpen their tools, the picture grows undeniable. These women lived, they ruled, they commanded and were obeyed. Their authority was not a deviation, It was embedded into the structure of their society. In Scythian culture, gender did not determine destiny. Skill, endurance, and spirit did. And so, generation after generation, women stepped into roles that Greek philosophers said could not exist. They hunted elk in the frozen dawn. They led raids across enemy encampments. They negotiated tribal alliances under stars that knew no border. Their lives were not perfect. They were short, often brutal, shaped by a world where mercy was a luxury few could afford. But within that hardness was autonomy, a sovereignty of self, so radical that even today it unsettles. What if the natural order we inherited was never natural at all? What if history is not a ladder, but a lattice with forgotten pathways leading sideways into other ways of living, other kinds of power? The Amazon warriors of Scythia are one such path. They show us that another world once lived, one where women carried blades not as rebellion, but as right. And they force us to ask, what was lost when we chose to forget them? What potential futures died with their erasure? The war they fought, the secret war, was not only for land or life or clan. It was for the story itself. And now, centuries too late, we begin to hear them, not as myths, not as dreams, but as women who once rode into battle beneath skies wide, enough to remember everything. To ride with the Amazon warriors of Scythia is to move against the current of Western historical memory, to step off the paved road of empire and into the tall, whispering grasses of a world long denied. Their war, waged in silence and exile, was never a campaign of conquest. It was a sustained defiance against the assumptions that power must belong to men. That legacy must be built in stone, that only those who leave behind a written chronicle deserve a place in the archives of civilization. But Scythia kept no scrolls. It carved no manifestos. Its truths were embodied in sinew, in scar, in the burial gifts of bronze and gold. The Amazon's history lived not in ink, but in ritual, in the laying of a quiver beside a ribcage, in the sacrifice of a horse to accompany its rider beyond death, in the careful placement of a mirror in a warrior's hand, a symbol, perhaps, not of vanity, but of self-knowing, of consciousness. These funerary rites were not acts of fantasy. They were acknowledgments. Here lies a leader. Here lies a protector. Here lies one of us. That such acknowledgment existed so deeply in the steppe, while remaining unthinkable in Athens or Rome, reveals the fracture not in the Scythians, but in us. For the societies that wrote history chose not to record what did not fit their blueprint. Of order, they chose exclusion over complexity. And so the Amazon, for all her reality, was painted into the corners of imagination. Yet even there, she resisted. She re-emerged in medieval romances, in operatic tragedies, in modern mythologies. Never fully erased, only reshaped. She became everything from the lover of Achilles to the queen of a forgotten island, to a comic book heroine wielding supernatural force. These distortions, though damaging, are also revealing. They show that her memory, however twisted, could not be killed. It continued to haunt the margins of power, whispering of a world where strength and sovereignty were not reserved for one half of humanity. Today, as history begins to account for what it once excluded, the Amazon returns not as fantasy, but as forensic fact. Her body, once doubted, is now mapped with the precision of science. Her wounds are documented, her tools analyzed, her DNA sequenced. Yet in all this newfound knowledge, there remains something more profound than data. Her presence. In grave after grave, across thousands of miles, she lies poised not as anomaly, but as precedent. She is not the exception. She is the rule we refuse to see. And so, to remember her now is not simply to reclaim the past, it is to confront the stories we tell about who we are and who we have always been. The Amazon does not belong to legend. She belongs to the lineage of reality we buried to make empire feel clean. The Amazon's reawakening is not just a rediscovery of historical fact. It is a reckoning with the architecture of forgetting itself. For centuries, the machinery of empire, church and academy collaborated, often unconsciously, to trim the past into a shape that justified the present. In such a version of history, power flowed from man to man, throne to throne, scroll to scroll. Linear, masculine, controlled. The steppe, by contrast, was everything this version feared. Fluid, female, ungoverned by stone or scripture. To acknowledge that women could lead, fight, and command in ancient times was to admit that patriarchy was not inevitable but constructed, not natural but imposed. That truth, buried beneath centuries of selective silence, now rises with every unearthed grave. It is no coincidence that many of these discoveries come not from imperial capitals, but from regions long ignored or dismissed by the Western canon places, like Tuva, Altai, the Don Steppes, and the Caspian Fringe. In these borderlands, teams of archaeologists, many of them women, are rewriting the terrain of historical authority. They are exhuming more than bodies. They are unearthing a different template for human potential. And what they find, again and again, is a society where gender did not prohibit violence or valor, where power was not inherited through male bloodlines alone, but earned through ritual, ability, and endurance. The Amazon warriors of Scythia did not demand equality, they embodied it. They did not rise as an exception to their world, but as its expression. And that, perhaps, is the most revolutionary aspect of their story, that their greatness was not radical. It was traditional. It belonged. They hunted not because they rebelled, but because it was their role. They ruled not because men failed, but because leadership was shared. Their presence in battle was not spectacle, it was structure. But when these women vanished from Western sight, the societies that followed filled the void with myth, turning them into a mirror that revealed more about the viewer than the viewed. The Greeks saw defiance and imagined monsters. The Victorians saw independence and imagined danger. Hollywood saw beauty and imagined fantasy. But in the steppes, the truth remained. They were neither monsters nor fantasies. They were warriors. And now, as we trace the arc of their arrows back through time, we begin to see where they truly landed, not in myth, not in metaphor, but in memory that refuses to lie still. Their war was never just about the blade. It was about the right to exist on their own terms. And that war, though ancient, is not over. It lives on in every question we ask about power, every excavation that challenges the canon, every refusal to let silence speak last. The final battles of the Amazon warriors were not fought with iron or flame, but with memory against a tide of erasure so vast it threatened to swallow even the bones. As the Scythian and Sarmatian world crumbled beneath the weight of foreign incursions, climatic shifts, and internal fragmentation, their legacy scattered with the winds, migrating with survivors into new tribes, new tongues, new borders. But the fire they carried, the principle that power was not bound by sex, that war and wisdom could be wielded by women, did not die. It flickered in the customs of migrating peoples, in the oral histories of the Caucasus, in the defiant echoes within the Nart sagas. And though the civilizations that rose in their place built higher walls, wrote grander histories, and crowned only men, they could never quite cleanse the record. The Amazons were too real to be extinguished and too dangerous to be accepted. So they were quarantined in myth, safer there, less threatening, less plausible. But every grave that emerges from the steppes cuts a wound in that myth. Each arrow found beside a woman's remains is a protest against the edited past. And now, through the lens of modernity, through carbon dating and DNA sequencing and gender-aware historiography, we are finally hearing them not as metaphors, but as messengers, They bring us not just stories of blood and battle, but of a worldview lost. A civilization that imagined roles differently, valued strength differently, and balanced power across both hands. In the ruins of that civilization lies a question too dangerous for ancient philosophers to answer, and too powerful for modern ones to ignore. What if patriarchy was not a beginning, but an interruption? A moment of imbalance rather than a law? Of nature? The Amazon warriors of Scythia remind us that history is not a straight line, but a circle, or perhaps, more accurately, a field open and wild. They lived not on the margins, but in the center of their own world. It was we who moved the margins around them. Now, as that center reasserts itself through dust and bone, the moral terrain of history begins to shift. The echo of hooves once lost in legend now reaches our ears as warning and invitation. Warning that the stories we were told were curated to keep power fixed and selective. Invitation to retell them fully, fiercely, and without fear of the truths they contain. The Amazons may have vanished from their homeland, but their war endures in every historian who refuses easy answers, in every girl who refuses narrow roles, in every soul who senses that strength need not wear a single face. In the quiet hours of excavation, beneath the wind-raked grasslands of Kazakhstan, the snow-bitten ridges of the Altai, the rust-colored steppes of the Don, a new kind of historian is at work. Not the chronicler of kings, nor the scribe of empires, but the listener. They kneel where no monuments stand, brushing away centuries with soft hands and hard discipline. What they uncover are not just relics, but revolutions buried not because they were irrelevant, but because they were inconvenient. Among the remains of a young woman found near Pavlodar, the iron tongue of truth rises through the soil. She was pierced in the back by a triangular arrowhead. Likely while retreating, though, her wounds suggest she fought long before that final blow. Her armor was light, meant for speed. Her ribs bore healing fractures from earlier battles. She had lived through war. She had returned to it, and she had died with a blade still sheathed at her hip. Not for ceremony, for reach, for survival. And she was buried with the same honors as any chieftain. This is not the tomb of an outlier. It is a window into a world that measured worth by courage, not convention. A world the Western canon refused to imagine because it threatened the illusion of singularity that only certain people, in certain cities, living certain ways, made history. But the Amazon warriors of Scythia defied that illusion. They spoke no Latin, prayed in no temples, pledged to no emperor. Yet their story reaches us still, not through marble inscriptions, but through the intimate record of the body. In every fused vertebra, in every bent arrow, in every war-scarred pelvis, the old assumptions fall away. This was not fiction. It was a forgotten truth, and the forgetting was deliberate. Even today, resistance persists. Museums hesitate to change their signage. Textbooks, if they mention these women at all, do so in margins or footnotes, always tempered with qualifiers. Possibly warriors, unusual burial, exception to cultural norms. But they were not exceptions. They were examples. Their story is not peripheral, it is foundational. Not merely as evidence of female warriors, but as proof that alternative structures of society existed, flourished, and challenged the universality of the Western model. The Amazon warriors of Scythia are not an ornament to our history, they are a correction. Their presence demands humility from those who claimed history belonged to the literate, the static, the male. It never did. It always belonged to the bold. They do not rise in stone. No cities bear their names. No calendar marks their victories. Yet the Amazon warriors of Scythia endure, not as myths on the fringe, but as truths rediscovered unbroken, unbowed, buried, but never lost. Their story is not one of legend, but of resistance. Resistance against time, against conquest, against the narrowing of history into a shape that excluded them. They were warriors, yes, but also daughters, leaders, healers, tacticians, riders, of great endurance who governed their own bodies, their own kin, their own warpaths. They carved no empires into marble, but they carved dignity into the wind. Their war, the secret war, was never simply for territory. It was for narrative. And though they died in dust and silence, they left behind a question more powerful than any monument. What if we've told history wrong? What if civilization was never built by men alone, but simply written that way? Every grave unearthed, every bone catalogued, every arrow lifted from its resting place in the earth is a fragment of rebellion, a whisper against the canon. And taken together, those whispers become thunder. The Scythian Amazon was not a footnote in a man's epic. She was her own epic, unwritten until now. She is not just a curiosity. She is a lost ancestor, staring back through centuries of distortion, with eyes that ask, who were you before they told you who to be? In remembering her, we do not just recover her story, we reclaim something of ourselves. The possibility that strength need not wear a crown, that leadership can gallop across grasslands without seeking to build walls. That memory, even when buried, does not sleep. It waits. And now it wakes. This is Candle and Coffin. Let's uncover the forgotten truth beneath the ashes of history. If this story moved you, subscribe for more untold histories that shaped our world.